For nearly a century, Jack Cooper Transport was a heavyweight in finished vehicle logistics, relying on veteran union drivers who spent generations safely moving Detroit's vehicles. But in early 2025, after years of rising cost pressure and failed contract talks, Ford and General Motors walked away from Jack Cooper. And for the drivers, it felt like Detroit had decided that decades of skill and loyalty were no longer worth paying for. For generations, when a vehicle rolled off an assembly line in Detroit, there was a strong chance a Jack Cooper driver was the one who moved it to the dealership, where someone finally bought it. The company had been hauling finished cars since the 1920s. It survived the Depression, the war years, and decade after decade of changes in how Americans bought cars. Jack Cooper was not a small regional outfit. It grew out of Kansas City car hauling work into a specialized finished vehicle network tied to assembly plants, rail ramps, ports, storage yards, and dealer routes across North America. By its later years, the company had more than 1,600 vehicles and 39 terminals in the United States and Canada. That matters because Jack Cooper was not just a trucking company. It was a whole system built around one narrow, demanding job: getting finished vehicles out of the factory pipeline and into dealer hands without damage. Then, in just a few years, the automakers it had served for generations walked away from them. This is not the story of drivers failing at their jobs. Jack Cooper's drivers were still some of the most skilled finished vehicle haulers in North America when the contracts started disappearing. The real question is why Detroit walked away from a workforce that had never stopped being good at the work. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what car hauling actually demands, because it is nothing like pulling a dry van. A finished vehicle is not freight that can be stacked, strapped, and forgotten. Every car loaded onto a Jack Cooper rig was a sellable product worth tens of thousands of dollars, and from the moment it was loaded until the moment a dealer signed for it, the driver was responsible for protecting its condition. That meant the job was not just driving, it was inspection, loading, securement, documentation, damage prevention, and delivery, all performed under the pressure of moving brand new vehicles that had to arrive ready to sell. This is where the story starts to turn. The driver's experience was still valuable, but Detroit was becoming less willing to pay extra for it. In car hauling, the risk was always there: a scratched fender, a cracked spoiler, undercarriage damage, or a dead battery could all turn into a claim. Every avoided claim meant less cost and paperwork, and one more vehicle arriving ready to sell. Experience showed up in the small decisions. They knew the plants, the rail ramps, and the tight dealership lots. They knew which vehicles needed extra care, which ramps were difficult, and how to move a loaded rig without turning one small mistake into a damage claim. That knowledge took years to build, and it was one of the main reasons the old model had worked for so long. Finished vehicle hauling has its own rules because the cargo is different. A dry van driver may never see the freight inside the trailer. A car hauler is involved with almost every vehicle from the moment he takes possession of it. He has to know what condition it was in, whether the keys are there, whether the paperwork matches where it belongs on the trailer, and how it has to come off at the other end. That changes the entire job. If a pallet shifts inside a trailer, the problem may not be visible until delivery. But on a car hauler, the cargo is exposed the whole time. A ramp angle or a tight dealer lot can matter. A few inches of roofline or mirror clearance could decide whether the delivery stayed clean or turned into a claim. Paperwork was an important part of the job, too. Finished vehicle logistics uses damage codes, inspection records, photos, VIN checks, key procedures, and delivery documentation to establish responsibility. A good car hauler was not just trying to get the load there, he was protecting himself, the company, the dealer, and the automaker from a claim that could turn into money, blame, and a vehicle that arrived no longer ready to sell. Even though that level of care was valuable, it also made Jack Cooper's old model expensive. The company was selling a transportation service built around experienced drivers, specialized equipment, and damage control procedures. The model itself was straightforward. Jack Cooper ran a unionized workforce with drivers represented by the Teamsters, and that meant something specific. It meant solid wages, real health benefits, and pension contributions. It meant seniority systems and work rules that gave experienced drivers stability and a reason to stay for 30 years instead of 3. For decades, automakers paid for that arrangement because it delivered reliability and network stability. A stable, experienced car-hauling workforce meant fewer damage claims, fewer delays, fewer surprises. When you are producing thousands of vehicles a day, predictability has a dollar value, and Detroit understood that. The premium they paid for union car haulers was the price of reliability, and for a long time, the math worked for everyone involved. The problem was that Detroit itself was changing. Automakers were no longer operating in the same world that had built Jack Cooper. For decades, the system had been built around long-term relationships. The same carriers serving the same plants, the same drivers learning the same ramps, the same routines repeated year after year. That stability made sense when domestic automakers dominated the market and vehicle volume was steady enough to support it. But by the 2000s, every part of the auto business was under pressure. Automakers were cutting costs in their plants, cutting costs from suppliers, cutting costs from parts logistics, and eventually cutting costs from finished vehicle transport too. Transportation was no longer treated as a relationship to protect. It became another line item to rebid, squeeze, and compare against cheaper alternatives. That changed the way Jack Cooper looked on paper. The company was no longer being judged mainly by stability, loyalty, or the experience behind its workforce. It was being judged by cost per move, contract flexibility, pension exposure, and how easily capacity could shift when volume changed. In that world, a veteran union workforce stopped looking like protection and started looking like a fixed expense. And once lower-cost carriers proved the vehicles could still move, the old premium became harder and harder to defend. Jack Cooper spent the 2000s and 2010s trying to survive inside that squeeze, and the company's ownership history during those years tells you how hard it was getting. The business changed hands and changed structure more than once, passing through different ownership groups that were each trying to make a century-old union hauling operation work in a market that was steadily turning against it. Each restructuring was an attempt to keep the company viable without abandoning the union model that was its entire identity. But no amount of financial reshuffling at the top could change what the automakers were willing to pay at the bottom. The pension obligations made the squeeze worse, and this is where the betrayal starts to take shape. Jack Cooper participated in the Central States Pension Fund, the large multi-employer Teamsters pension plan, and that fund spent years in serious financial trouble. For a company already struggling to compete on price, multi-employer pension liability became a heavy and unpredictable cost. The kind of obligation that scared off potential buyers and made every contract negotiation harder. The drivers had earned those pensions over full careers. They were deferred compensation, wages set aside across decades of moving Detroit's vehicles. But to an automaker comparing carriers on a spreadsheet, a hauler weighed down by pension exposure was simply a more expensive and riskier option than a non-union competitor with none of that baggage. By the back half of the 2010s, the contract losses were no longer occasional. They were the trend. General Motors, Ford, and the other automakers that had relied on Jack Cooper for generations began shifting finished vehicle business toward lower-cost carriers, and each lost contract pulled volume out of a network that needed volume to function. The numbers showed how serious the damage already was. By 2019, Jack Cooper was still a major car hauler with more than 1,600 vehicles and a network of 39 terminals across the United States and Canada. But the business underneath that network was shrinking. From 2016 to 2018, revenue fell from about $612 million to $537 million, and the number of vehicles it shipped dropped almost 17%. Toyota was the clearest warning. It had been Jack Cooper's third largest customer, but over that same period, Jack Cooper lost roughly 80% of Toyota's business as Toyota moved work to lower-cost, non-union carriers. That was not a small leak. That was a major automaker pulling away from the old model, and Jack Cooper could not easily hide the damage. The company closed 17 terminals, and about 250 drivers and mechanics lost their jobs. Its truck fleet was aging too, with an average age of more than 14 years because the company did not have enough room to keep investing in new equipment. That detail matters. When a company cannot replace equipment in a business as specialized as car hauling, it tells you the squeeze is no longer theoretical. It is showing up in the terminals, in the maintenance shop, and in the equipment the drivers have to use every day. At the same time, Jack Cooper's biggest customers were demanding better pricing. GM made up almost half of the company's revenue in 2018, and in 2019, GM received a 5% price concession under a new 3-year contract with no annual price increases. Ford, the company's second-largest customer, also received a price concession that year. So Jack Cooper was not just losing work to cheaper competitors. It was also being pushed by the customers. It still had to become cheaper itself. That made the situation dangerous. Jack Cooper was trying to protect union jobs, pension obligations, terminals, equipment, and a national car hauling network. At the same time, its biggest customers were either moving work away or forcing down the rates. The company did not need one dramatic failure to start falling apart. The pressure was already visible years before Ford and GM finally walked away. Toyota showed the industry that automakers were willing to trade the old Jack Cooper model for cheaper capacity. Once that door opened, Ford and GM did not have to imagine what leaving Jack Cooper would look like. They had already seen another automaker do it. Once that shift started, Jack Cooper was fighting the math of its own business. Car hauling is not a business where losing one major account simply means filling empty space with random freight. Everything is specialized. The terminals are positioned around plants, rail ramps, ports, and dealer lanes. A car hauling operation needs steady volume from major automakers because the entire system is built around moving finished vehicles in waves. When that volume disappears, the damage spreads quickly. A truck that used to leave full may now leave with fewer units. A terminal that once had predictable flow may still have the same rent, equipment, and staffing costs, but less revenue coming through the gate. That's what made each lost contract so dangerous. It did not just remove revenue, it weakened the whole structure that made the remaining work profitable. In 2019, that pressure finally caught up with Jack Cooper. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with pension obligations and debt among the biggest financial burdens it was trying to manage while competing against lower-cost carriers that did not carry the same weight. That restructuring bought time. It helped reshape the company's finances and kept the trucks moving, but it did not fix the deeper problem. The customers were still choosing someone else. The drivers felt all of this directly. A car hauler who had spent 20 or 30 years with the company watched the available work shrink as named accounts moved to competitors. Routes that had been steady for a generation thinned out. Terminals that had been busy slowed down. But the deeper problem was not just fewer loads, it was leverage. Jack Cooper depended on a handful of giant automaker accounts, and those automakers held the power. They could renew a lane, rebid it, split it between multiple carriers, or move it somewhere else entirely. Jack Cooper did not have the option of replacing that business with ordinary freight, because its trucks, terminals, drivers, and whole operating model were built around finished vehicles. Every lost contract made the next negotiation harder. Jack Cooper had less freight to offer its drivers, less revenue to support the business, and less leverage when the next automaker came to the table. That's how the old model unraveled. Not in one dramatic break, but lane by lane and contract by contract, as automakers found cheaper options, and Jack Cooper had fewer ways to push back. By the time Ford and GM walked away, the company was not just losing customers, it was losing the volume that made the entire system work. The end came fast in 2025. On January 2nd, Ford gave Jack Cooper a 30-day notice that it was ending the work, even though the contract was not expiring. Jack Cooper described the notice as unexpected, and the fallout hit almost immediately. The Liberty, Missouri operation alone faced a permanent closure affecting more than 400 employees. Then the GM relationship broke down. GM was Jack Cooper's largest customer, and both sides blamed the other for the collapse. GM said Jack Cooper had planned to stop services, forcing GM to use other providers. Jack Cooper said GM had decided to pull all of its business and rejected proposals to keep working together. Either way, the result was the same. After Ford left, the GM work could not be saved. By March 2025, Jack Cooper had filed for Chapter 7 liquidation. This was no longer a restructuring meant to keep the trucks moving. It was the end of the company as its drivers knew it. And 1,700 Teamsters were left facing the loss of car hauling jobs that had supported generations of families. Retirees and pension obligations were left to the bankruptcy process and the pension system because once again, the people who had earned their benefits over full careers on the road were left depending on someone else to honor what the company no longer could. The equipment, the specialized multi-car rigs that almost no other kind of freight operation can use, faced sale and dispersal. The terminals that had been positioned near assembly plants and rail ramps for decades went quiet.